Hi, I'm Arnie Skelton, and each week in this podcast series I'm going to offer you my top 10 tips on particular topics or themes that might be of interest to you as a teacher or manager or both. Hi, and welcome to this week's podcast, which is all about managing poor performance. So before I start with the 10 tips, just a quick word about that. It's going to be about preventing as well as addressing poor performance. An earlier podcast of mine looked at challenging conversations, which is how to have an effective conversation around poor performance. But this one is about how to diagnose what's led to poor performance and how to prevent such poor performance from happening in the first place. So, let's have a look at my top 10 tips. Tip number 1. Poor performance is essentially the gap between what's required and what's delivered. So addressing poor performance is essentially closing that performance gap. But before you can close such a gap, you have to have two lines that separate what's required and what's delivered. And the two lines both need to be specified. So in order for there to be some evidence of poor performance, there has to be evidence of what's required and evidence of what's actually being delivered. Without such evidence of those two measures, you really can't go forward in addressing poor performance. So my first tip is to establish the two measures of what's required and what's actually being delivered. That way you've got evidence that there is a performance gap. Tip number 2. First of all, let's look at the requirement, the demand side. And I'm going to look at a 5-letter mnemonic called PIMST, P-I-M-S-T. And my next four tips are going to spell those P-I-M-S-T requirements out. So tip number 2 really is to look at P-I, which is performance indicators. In order for you to specify what's required, you need to specify what's being required in terms of what's important. And we call those the performance indicators, and that's really a good term. It means what indicates the quality of the performance. And these are variables to do with the characteristics required. So, for example, if you were purchasing a car, some of the performance indicators might be fuel economy, safety, appearance, comfort, boot capacity, acceleration, reliability. These are all things that you're looking for in a car. These qualities, these characteristics, define what's required. So establish in the performance, what are the performance indicators? What are the things that matter? Typically they'll include things like accuracy and reliability and punctuality and meeting professional requirements. So your first element of requirement is what are the performance indicators. Tip number 3, the M of PIMST, is measure. How will you measure such indicators? You need a reliable measure and a measure that's accepted by both yourself and whoever's performing whose performance you want to measure. So, for example, if you were measuring punctuality, you would measure, or the measure would be, time. If you were measuring accuracy, your measure would be error rate. So establish the measures through which the performance indicators will be judged, and make sure both you and the person whose performance is going to be measured agree on those measures. If you think that's fairly obvious, try this one. Reliability. How would you measure the reliability of a car, to use my previous example? Starts first time? Possibly. Cost of keeping the car on the road, servicing costs, and so on. So if you used each of those measures, they might provide different outcomes in terms of reliability. So different measures will produce different results. So that's why we need to be specific around how we are going to measure any particular performance indicator. Tip number 4 is to agree the standards required. That's the S of PIMST, P-I-M-S-T. So S stands for standard, and a standard is the minimum performance required. It's the baseline, the base level at which that performance is acceptable. So going back to the car again, the minimum acceptable in terms of fuel economy might be that it does at least 40 miles to the gallon. In terms of accuracy, it might be that there is less than 2% error rate. So a standard establishes the minimum requirement. And if it's a minimum requirement, it has the effect of a promise to the customer. This is what you can expect realistically from this performance. And that's important for a customer point of view. They need to know what to expect. So for example, an opening hours of any company will be a standard. We will be open between 9 and 5. It has the status of a promise. The fifth tip is target. Now, a lot of people think a standard and a target are the same things, but they're not. Whereas a standard is a minimum requirement to be delivered, a target is an aim, an aspiration. So we can regard a standard as an expectation and a target as an aspiration, something to be aimed for. The importance here is that in measuring performance, we need to be pretty hard on standards that are not met, because after all they have the status of a promise, and a promise not met is problematic. Whereas a target is meant to be aspirational. It is meant to drive performance upwards, and it's not as crucial if it's not met. So there should be a difference between a standard, which is a minimum requirement, and a target, which is an ideal requirement. Here's a good example of how the two might vary. If you have a customer charter, then have a look at how you've spelt that out. If you have said, for example, we will deliver the following, that's a promise, as identified in the language of we will. If, on the other hand, your customer charter says we aim to, then that's a target. The difference between we will, which is a promise, and we aim to, which is a target. So be clear about the difference between the two. Tip number 6. We now need to move on to the supply side. What are the resources required in order to deliver the demand side? So let's have a look at 4 key resources, which are summarized by my mnemonic RKSA. It rhymes, so it's reasonably easy to remember. RKSA. And we'll look at each of those 4 elements in turn. So tip number 6, the first of those elements is the word resources. Does the individual whose performance is going to be measured have the resources necessary? That includes clearly a budget, it also includes time, and it includes the relevant materials and equipment and access to them. So, does the individual have the resources required? That's tip number 6. Tip number 7 is the K of RKSA, which is knowledge. Does the individual know what is required? And this breaks into 2 separate elements. Does the individual know what is required? And that means, is the specification clear? Is the goal clear? Are the performance indicators clear? And so on. Does the individual know what is required? And another type of knowledge requirement, does the individual know why it's required? Do they understand its significance or importance? Because if the individual can't see any point in this particular requirement, then they're less likely to be motivated and to prioritize it. So, tip number 7, make sure the individual knows what is required and why. Tip number 8 is really about the S of skills. So in terms of the RKSA, the S stands for skills. Does the individual have the skills necessary to deliver the performance required? And that means not just the base skills, but the skills to operate at the standard or target set. So, Does the individual have the skills required? Tip number 8. And tip number 9, the A of RKSA, is attitude. I need to say a little bit about this. Does the individual have an appropriate attitude for completing the task, for performing well? Attitude is probably the single biggest predictor of behaviour. If the individual is interested in the job and motivated by the job, they're more likely to do the job. But it's not a causal relationship. Somebody can still have a less than positive attitude to a job, but still do it well. In some ways, that's the essence of professionalism, to not actually value the job, but do your best nonetheless. That's what you would expect of any professional worker, because, let's face it, not every element of every job that we're paid to do is motivational, is something we would choose to do. It just goes with the territory that as part of work we do sometimes have to do things that we're less than thrilled by. But it's the job, and it's the job that we're paid for, and if we have a sense of professionalism and professional pride, we'll do it to the best of our ability anyway, even if we don't like it. And that's the difference between a less than positive attitude but a very positive behaviour. And in a sense, it's the difference between a negative attitude to the task and a positive attitude to your own professionalism. So attitude's a really important variable, and crucial in any performance is getting the individual to at least respect the job and have a positive professional attitude towards it. So tip number 9, create or have a positive attitude towards the job. So just to quickly recap, we've got on the demand side PIMST, Performance Indicator, Measures, Standards and Targets, which together, if you like, contain and qualify the requirement for the job. And then on the supply side, RKSA, the resources, knowledge, skills and attitude necessary in and for the employee to deliver that job. So it's all really about the balance between demand and supply, between what's actually required and the ability of the individual to deliver it. So tip number 10, the final tip. It's to distinguish really between two types of performance: task performance and behaviour performance. For a long time, most performance has been judged around the task, how well the individual has delivered the task, and much less has been said in the past about how the person has done that task behaviourally, their approach, their demeanour. This is changing, and increasingly behavioural measures are being put into competency frameworks, for instance, to help assess performance. So it's not just about how well somebody does a job, but about their general behaviour in and at work. Somebody could be brilliant at a job, but actually be foul-mouthed, sulky, petulant, not being a very effective team player or communicator. And this is actually quite demoralising for the workforce and makes general work quite difficult. So increasingly organisations are having some behaviour standards and targets as indicators of performance alongside task standards and targets. So one thing to think about is whether you want to introduce behaviour standards as measures of performance as well as task standards. So that's it. My top 10 tips. Next week we're going to have a look at how to manage and inspire and reward or even prevent the opposite, high performance. So next week's all about managing high performance. But to recap the top 10 tips for this week, here we go. Poor performance, tip number 1. Poor performance is essentially the gap between what's required and what's delivered, so make sure you set measures for both. Tip number 2, identify the key performance indicators in the task. Tip number 3, be clear how you're going to measure those performance indicators. Tip number 4, ensure that you have a baseline set of standards by which the performance can be measured. Tip number 5, and or whether you want to set any targets which are more aspirational than expectational. Tip number 6, looking at the supply side of RKSA, has the individual got the resources necessary to complete the job well? Tip number 7, does the individual know what's required and why it's required? Tip number 8, does the individual have the skills required? Tip number 9, does the individual have a positive attitude either towards the task or to their professional commitment to delivering a good task, whatever? And tip number 10, consider the requirement to have behaviour requirements as well as task requirements as your approach to performance management. So that's it. Thanks very much for listening. Bye for now. Thank you for listening. If you've enjoyed this podcast, make sure you subscribe. You will still get the podcast for free, but you will also get an alert to let you know when the next podcast is available. And please recommend the podcast to anyone else you think might like it and benefit from it. Also, I'd really appreciate it if you could leave a review and any other comment, because they'll help promote the podcast series on the relevant platform. So, bye for now.